thank you for your organisation, Animal Rights, for organising this and all the amazing work that you're doing at the moment in Belgium and the Netherlands. And it's a great privilege to be joined by my good friend who I'll introduce in a little bit, Chris Mercer. So I'm going to try and tell you some of the main things that you need to know about trophy hunting, about the industry, the lobbyists who are trying to make it easier to shoot protected species, and how they're influencing the political system and international bodies. And then I'm going to say a little bit about what we can do to help abolish it. So let's jump straight in. First, the basic facts. So trophy hunting is a huge global business. It's estimated to be worth $200 million. In fact, the industry says that it's probably even more than that. The scale of the killing is mind-blowing. So in the last decade alone, as many as 1.7 million animals have been shot by trophy hunters, of which about 300,000, more or less, were species that are protected by law. So who are the hunters? Most trophy hunters are Americans, about 70%, but EU countries make up most of the remaining 30%, although there's been a huge rise recently in the number of Chinese trophy hunters. And in fact, they are now second in the global league table. The animals most popular with trophy hunters include some of the most iconic and indeed threatened members of the animal kingdom. As there's a campaign right now by Animal Rights to get trophy imports banned in Belgium, I'm going to use Belgium as an example. So if we look at the most recent year, for which full figures are available for Belgium, we can see that the hunting trophies being brought home by Belgian hunters that year included cheetahs, leopards, bears, monkeys, elephants, zebras, lions, hippopotamuses, wild goats, and many, many, many other species. The lions that were shot by Belgian hunters had all been bred in captivity in South Africa, specifically for the purpose of becoming a hunter's trophy, and they were shot within an enclosure, and Chris will tell you much more about that later. The same goes for the cougar that was shot by a Belgian hunter in an enclosure in Argentina that same year. And if you just look back a year or two, you don't need to go very far back at all, then you can see that Belgian hunters have also been shooting rhinoceroses and polar bears. And they've also shot an animal called the Scimitar horned oryx. Now, the Scimitar horned oryx is a type of antelope that was shot to extinction in the wild about 30 years ago. But you can still go to some private ranches in South Africa and in the US state of Texas, which have some of these if you want to shoot one and get that extra special trophy, that of an animal which technically no longer exists. So where do Belgian and other hunters go to shoot animals for trophies? Well, a lot of them go to Africa, of course, and South Africa is very much the hub of the whole African safari industry. But it's actually not the most popular country for international trophy hunters. To many people's surprise, it's Canada. And the reason for that in large part is that there's an absolutely huge bear hunting industry in Canada. So over the last decade, as many as 130,000 bears have been shot by trophy hunters who'd come from all over the world to shoot in Canada. And Canada, in fact, is the only country in the world that still allows polar bears to be shot by trophy hunters. Russia, it's banned it. The US, it's got polar bears in Alaska, it's banned it as well. And there's also actually a thriving commercial trade in polar bear furs, so particularly for Chinese clients. So as a result of that, since the 1960s, 50,000 polar bears have been shot, either for their skins or for so-called sport. To put that into context, into perspective, today there are just 20,000 polar bears left in the world. Now, we all know that polar bears are threatened with extinction because of climate change, but some conservationists actually argue that the hunting of polar bears for skins and sport, that's an even bigger threat to their survival than climate change. And the fact is that trophy hunting has had a huge impact on virtually all wildlife populations right from the very beginning. So the modern day trophy hunting industry as we know it, it started in the 19th century when the British and the Belgians and other European colonial powers actively encouraged it in Africa, in part to help settle new areas. And you could, for example, get a £50 permit from the British colonial authorities. And that gave you the right to shoot huge numbers of all sorts of African animals, including an unlimited number of lions and leopards, because these were considered to be vermin. So during the 19th century, it's estimated that colonial trophy hunters shot something like 20 million animals. And there are at least two animals that went extinct at the hands of these hunters. So one was the bluebok, which was an antelope found in South Africa. The other was a quagga, which was an animal very similar to the zebra. The last quagga that was hunted was shot by a member of the British royal family, actually, during a big hunting expedition in 1860. Anyway, so the slaughter continued into and throughout the 20th century. Well, this time it was the Americans taking the lead. And the pioneer of 20th century trophy hunting was an American president, Theodore Roosevelt. So when he stepped down as president of the US, he went on a year-long hunting trip throughout Africa with his son Kermit, in which together they killed over 500 animals. So over the last 200 years, there's been a catastrophic collapse in wildlife populations, which has gone alongside this 2 centuries long killing spree. But many of these same animals are still being killed in large numbers, despite the fact that they've disappeared from much of their range and that some are barely hanging on for survival. So if we take the example of African elephants, for example, at the beginning of the 19th century, when the British and other Europeans were getting going hunting in Africa, there was about 20 million African elephants. 100 years later, the beginning of the 20th century, it'd come down to about 10 million. Today, about another 100 years down the line, there are less than 500,000. Despite this, by the way, elephants are still the most popular animal with British trophy hunters and some other nations too. And now, of course, elephants and other wild species have got other additional problems to contend with as well, such as poaching. Now, I should actually say it's important to remember that when we're talking about poaching, that the only material difference between poaching and trophy hunting is essentially, if you're white and you're wealthy and you can buy a permit from the government to kill an animal, then that's called trophy hunting. If you're poor and black and you're not able to get a permit, then that's called poaching. But while the African may have killed the animal, I don't know, for food or to try to get out of poverty, the European or American has just killed the animal because they fancied it. They fancied killing an animal for entertainment. Right now, when you add the two things together, right now, more elephants are being killed by trophy hunters and poachers together every year than are born. So before you include diseases or droughts or deaths because elephants are killed, persecuted because they've gone and destroyed somebody's crops, etc., elephants are fighting a losing battle. Every year starts with a negative balance sheet. And now in Botswana, actually, they actually stopped elephant trophy hunting in 2014 because of the impacts that it was having. And the population there stabilized. Botswana, it's not a big country, it's about the size of France. It now has 1/3 of all the world's remaining African elephants. There are twice as many elephants in Botswana than in any other African country. Unfortunately, the new president of Botswana is bringing back trophy hunting. And there's been a lot of behind-the-scenes lobbying about this by the industry. And one of the reasons is that Botswana's elephants are renowned for having some of the biggest and the best tusks, i.e. the best trophies. Now, this is really important to trophy hunters because if you're a trophy hunter and you want to get, for example, your elephant trophy recognized in the industry's record books, which is something they all aspire to, you have to shoot the elephants with the biggest tusks. And the way they do it, you kill the elephant, they then weigh the tusks, and the weight is verified by an official, what they call a master measurer. And if the tusks weigh more than 90 pounds, which is about 40 kilograms, then you, the trophy hunter, you get your name into the coveted book, the records book. And the industry records book actually gives specific advice to hunters of where to go. So, for example, go to here in Zimbabwe, for instance, if you want to get into the records book. But there's a problem with this, and it's a really big problem. If you're shooting the biggest, the strongest elephants, you're taking the best genes out of that species gene pool. It leaves just the smaller, the less fit elephants, if you like, behind to breed and pass on their genes to future generations. And scientists call this artificial selection. It's the opposite of natural selection. And so what we're seeing now is that African elephants' tusks are getting significantly shorter than they were a few years ago. In fact, the hunting industry's own records confirm this. They suggest that trophy tusks are now approximately 25% smaller than they were 40 or 50 years ago. And there are some scientific studies suggest that the decline might actually have been greater than that. And we're also seeing an increasing number of adult elephants with no tusks at all. So mostly, perhaps unsurprisingly, in areas which have seen the greatest numbers of trophy hunters. And this creates a new danger for elephants because, as well as being the greater risk of diseases because they're less robust or resilient, genetically speaking, they're also now going to be much more vulnerable during periods of drought. And this is because one of the prime functions of an elephant's tusk is to access water from underneath dry riverbeds. So it's not going to be able to do that with shorter or non-existent tusks. And droughts, unfortunately, as we know, are going to be a growing problem, and they are getting to be a bigger problem because of climate change. So this could be a real disaster for elephants. And researchers have also chronicled the almost total disappearance of the so-called big tusker elephants. These are the ones whose tusks are so long they touch the ground. Conservationists think that there may be only 30 or 40 African big tusker elephants left in the world. So now let's talk a bit about lions. As many of you know, it's World Lion Day today, and it's almost exactly 5 years since the killing of Cecil the lion by that American dentist and trophy hunter, Walter Palmer. So Cecil's death, you may remember, it was huge news all over the world. It was one of the biggest media stories of all time. But despite all of that furore, it hasn't stopped the trophy hunters. So in the 5 years since Cecil was killed, another 6,000 lions have been shot by trophy hunters. Just to put that into perspective, there are thought to be only 20,000 lions remaining in the wild. Some think actually the number could be even lower than that. And if we look at the overall pattern, so in 1800, before the colonial trophy hunters really started shooting lions left, right, and center, it's thought that the number of lions in Africa was somewhere around the 1.2 million mark. And even around the time of World War II, people were thinking there's about 450,000. Now there's 20,000. And that means actually there's fewer lions today than there are rhinoceroses or even orangutans. And the US government actually believes that the lion could be extinct in the wild by the year 2050, which isn't that far away. That would be the first time ever in any part of the world that a big cat has disappeared from the earth since the extinction of the Sabretooth tiger in prehistoric times. Now, individual hunters have sometimes shot huge numbers of lions, for many years, right from the beginning, but to the current day as well. So, for example, there was a guy called George Yank Allen. I think he died in 1924. He single-handedly shot 300 lions. Paul James Rainey, who died a year earlier, he shot 200. He used to take a pack of dogs out hunting with him. More recently, there was a British hunter called John Alexander Hunter. He died, I think it's 1963. He's believed to have killed 600 lions. And he would travel around Africa by train. And he would shoot the lions from the carriage window. So once he'd shot one, he would pull the train alarm so that the train would stop. And then he would go and collect the dead animal and bring it onto the train. There's a Spanish lion hunter who's still alive today. He's called Tony Sanchez Areno. His current tally is 340 lions. Sanchez Areno has also shot, I think it's 1,317 elephants, and then hundreds of rhinos and leopards, thousands of buffaloes, etc. So they're killing lots and lots of animals single-handedly. And there's a great deal of scientific evidence, actually, about the impacts of trophy hunting, specifically on lions. So scientists say that trophy hunting in parts of Africa has been the single greatest impact on local lion populations, far greater than any other cause, whether it's persecution or poaching or natural mortality and so on. And yet, despite this, and despite Cecil, despite falling numbers in the wild, there's evidence to suggest that lion trophy hunting is actually on the increase. So if we look at the number of trophies taken home annually by hunters over the last decade, it's jumped by about 14% over that decade. And there's now growing interest in lion hunting from hunters from new countries, Eastern European countries, South American countries, and also from China. So in 2017, which is the most recent year that we've got fully comprehensive data that's in the public domain, hunters from no fewer than 57 different countries traveled from all over the world to Africa to shoot a lion for a trophy. Now, at the top of that list, perhaps unsurprisingly, were the Americans. American hunters always first. But in second place was Hungary, and Belgium was in third place. Right. Now, lions, they're in free fall throughout Africa. In Tanzania, for example, in recent times, which has been the stronghold of the species, scientists say that trophy hunting seems to have been the primary driver of a decline in lion numbers. In Zimbabwe, scientists warned that in another decade, trophy hunters alone will have wiped out nearly all remaining lions in Zimbabwe. In fact, they had to bring in a temporary moratorium on trophy hunting because numbers were collapsing. Zambia is another country this happened to. So it used to have a big population until quite recently. So in 2005, for example, there were more than 3,000 lions in the Kafue region of Zambia. 10 years later, 2015, there was about 250. So a whole load of them had just disappeared. And this disaster in Zambia actually prompted the authorities to implement a temporary ban on trophy hunting in part of the country. In 2013, it was brought in, and scientists there, they actually did a study of the lion population before the ban, so when trophy hunting was still going on, and after, so when the ban was in place. And what they found was that the lion population made a remarkable recovery. In fact, lion numbers overall in that area almost doubled. But one of the problems is that when independent scientists have tried to speak out, when they've tried to raise the alarm, talk about what's going on, they've often found themselves hounded out, victimized, or even kicked out. So Craig Packer, for example, he's a scientist who has been studying the lions of the Serengeti for many years. He exposed some of the corruption within the hunting industry. As a result, he was kicked out of the country. He was expelled. And worse still, he was replaced by a scientist affiliated with Safari Club International, which is the world's biggest trophy hunting group. And this isn't the only time that something like this has happened. Okay, so I've talked about the huge numbers of lions killed and the catastrophic collapse of lion populations. But I want to tell you that there's probably an even bigger problem than the sheer number of lions that are dying. I mentioned just before about the effects of artificial selection on African elephants. Well, the effects of artificial selection on lions are being seen in pretty dramatic fashion, so much so that the lion could be fast approaching that cliff edge point beyond which there's no return. There have been studies which recently showed that the genetic diversity of the lion species has shrunk. It's about 15% smaller than it was just a few decades ago, about a century ago. And the implications of this are pretty big. So what evolutionary biologists are telling us is that, well, look, trophy animals, they're the most evolutionary fit. They're the ones with the high quality genes that a population needs to have if it's going to be able to adapt quickly to a changing environment. And of course, with climate change, we're talking about a very rapidly changing environment and becoming increasingly hostile. So, and what they've actually warned is if you take away just 5% of the high quality males, then you risk wiping out the entire population. Now, hunting industry is completely oblivious to this. And like with elephants, it actually advises hunters where they should go if they want to find the big lions to shoot, which are likely to earn them a place in the records books. And the safari hunting companies do the same. They openly advertise the fact that they've helped their clients shoot the record-sized animals. So there's one company, for example, that says over 90% of its trophies qualify for entry into the record books. Now, you might have thought that in the face of this disaster scenario, lion hunting would be banned, or that lions would be classed as endangered. You'd be wrong on both counts. Lions, rather surprisingly, they're not classed as endangered, they're classed as vulnerable on IUCN's red list of threatened species, which is kind of like the standard or the gold standard listing for the vulnerability of different animals. Now, this has been pretty controversial. Scientists have said, look, the overwhelming majority of lion populations, they've declined at a rate which absolutely meets the criteria for being categorized as endangered. And in 2015, in fact, the IUCN Red Data Survey specifically recommended that lions be upgraded so that they'd be endangered, not vulnerable. Didn't work. their calls fell on deaf ears. Now, coincidence or not, one of the world's leading all-time lion hunters, and who happens to be the man who's probably the world's leading hunting industry lobbyist, for over a decade, he's been allowed to sit on the Lion Experts Committee of IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which does the categorization. He's got no scientific qualifications. He was previously the president of Safari Club International, which I said before is the world's largest trophy hunting organization, which, it so happens, spent $1.3 million on a lobbying campaign to stop the lion from being classed as endangered. And the reason they did this is because if the lion was classed as endangered, then under US law, for example, it'd be much harder for American trophy hunters to legally shoot lions, or certainly bring their trophies back home with them. And the lobbying by the industry is really one of the key reasons why trophy hunting continues to stay, despite the public opposition. And in fact, to counter the widespread public opposition to trophy hunting, the industry has had to develop a public relations friendly narrative, story, image. So what the industry has done is it's tried to rebrand itself, reshape itself as a conservation movement. And it's also set up conservation front organizations in order to promote this argument that trophy hunting is wildlife conservation. So the NRA, the National Rifle Association, the gun rights group, it now calls itself a conservation organization. It's very active now in the whole trophy hunting debate. Safari Club International, the biggest trophy hunting organization, it calls itself a conservation organization. Dallas Safari Club is another of the very big hunting organizations, which, amongst other things, it auctions off black rhinos, which are critically endangered, auctions off hunts of critically endangered black rhinos. It says it's a conservation organization. In fact, it's become a member of IUCN, the World Conservation Union. But there's one organization that's at the heart of this strategy, and indeed very much at the heart of the entire global lobbying strategy by the hunting industry. And it calls itself Conservation Force. And I recommend you have a look at the website. If you go to its website, the mission, it says things like we're about wildlife conservation, education, research, serving the greater public, developing conservation infrastructure, etc., etc. Sounds like a conservation organization. And Conservation Force is a member of IUCN. It's an official observer to CITES, the global wildlife trade regulators. Let me make this really clear. Conservation Force is not a conservation organization. It is a hunting lobby group. The founder and the chairman of Conservation Force is called John J. Jackson III. He's one of the world's top elephant and lion hunters of all times. I think he's also one of the top spotted hyena hunters as well. Anyway, he's got multiple entries in the Safari Club International Records book for lions and leopards and elephants and so on. He's a past president of Safari Club International. In his personal trophy room in his home in Louisiana in the States, he's got dozens of animals in there. So leopards, lions, polar bears, elephants, and more. He once described elephant hunting by saying, let me read this to you. He said, nothing else in life is more satisfying than an elephant hunt. And he said something very similar about lion hunting. He said, I'll quote this to you, I can plainly see the African lion that has leaped into the air the moment its head snaps backward and explodes with smoke from my bullet. Anyway, so what Jackson, who's a lawyer, by the way, and Conservation Force do is that they lobby politicians and international conservation decision-making bodies like CITES, specifically to remove or to reduce the protections that are given to wildlife. In other words, to make it easier for hunters to be able to legally hunt them and take their trophies back home with them. And Conservation Force works with and represents about 200 of the world's main hunting bodies. And it's been almost single-handedly responsible for some of the most significant rulings, either by national governments or international bodies, on what you can or can't hunt and what you can take a trophy home of. So, for example, they succeeded in getting elephant trophy imports from much of Africa allowed again. They succeeded in getting several endangered animals downlisted, they call it, into lower categories so that there are fewer restrictions on hunting them. They've defeated efforts to stop white rhino hunting and so on. And they've been working on weakening the laws in the US that it had been stopping lion and polar bear trophies from coming back into the States. Well, they're now coming back. And Jackson has even been an advisor to the White House on wildlife policy. And when the state of the US state of New Jersey decided to ban hunting trophies from coming in through its airports and seaports, Jackson and Conservation Force took the state of New Jersey to court and won. So the ban was overturned. Jackson also developed something called the Enhancement Initiative. Now, what this does is it argues that trophy hunting endangered species improves their conservation prospects. And somehow, this notion has been accepted by the US government. And this actually is what made it possible for American hunters to be allowed to shoot critically endangered black rhinos and take their trophies home with them. And there's a number of other directors of Conservation Force, also known to be prolific trophy hunters who've been sitting on key committees at IUCN. I'm going to tell you about another of these self-styled so-called hunter conservationists. He's a man called Ron Thompson. He's from Zimbabwe, and he set up and runs an organization called the True Green Alliance. Ron Thompson has shot more than 5,000 elephants. 5,000 elephants. And he openly boasts that he has, this is a quote, he has by far hunted more than any other man alive. And he recently described NGOs' calls for a ban on wildlife trade with China as tantamount to treason, and said that animal welfare groups are the paedophiles of the wildlife industry. So the True Green Alliance and conservation, that's what he's about. He's very close to the former Secretary General of CITES, Eugene Lapointe. He doesn't like me very much. Frankly, I can live with that. Now, the whole strategy has been well funded. It's very clever. So Safari Club International, it spent over $140 million on lobbying politicians and organizations since the year 2000. That's a lot of money. It's recruited powerful supporters, including leading American politicians and generals. It receives major donations from gun makers like Beretta and ammunition manufacturers, and sponsorship from major brands like Yamaha. The owners of Budweiser have been big donors, also the oil industry, wealthy hunters, and so on. And Safari Club International has something called a PAC, a Political Action Committee. It's one of the biggest in the US. What a PAC is, it's a mechanism by which to funnel financial contributions to the campaigns of election candidates. Safari Club International says that its PAC is bigger than some of America's biggest corporations, including General Motors. So to give you an example, Ryan Zinke, who later became the US Interior Secretary under Donald Trump, and so the man responsible for America's hunting laws and trophy import regulations, he's received thousands of dollars from Safari Club International's PAC for his election campaigns to the US Congress. Other leading politicians to receive donations include the Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State. Who else? There's John Boehner, who is the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, and so on. In 2016, which, like 2020, was a major election year in the US, so presidential elections and Congress and so on, Safari Club International made contributions to the campaigns of politicians in over 1/3 of the House of Representatives seats and more than half of the Senate seats that were up. So as well as lobbying politicians, though, Safari Club has got a powerful in-house team of lawyers, and it's brought dozens of cases to the courtroom. It's filed briefs with the US Supreme Court, including about the right to hunt exotic wild animals on private ranches in the US, and also to be able to hunt in wildlife refuges. One of the other things that Safari Club International does is to educate children about hunting. So if you look at the website of Safari Club International's foundation, it shows children being taught how to shoot and taking part in hunts. In fact, there's various programs. There's thousands of children actually who are being taught trophy hunting every year through the work of Safari Club and the NRA and other organizations. Now, it's thanks in large part to Safari Club International's awards that trophy hunters are killing so many animals from so many different species each year. So Safari Club International has over 80 different award schemes that you can win if you shoot lots of animals. You have to shoot a minimum number of animals, sometimes using a variety of different weapons. Sometimes the hunter has to jet around the world to different continents in order to be eligible for those awards. So, for example, there's one award where you have to shoot over 100 different animals from different species to be eligible. If you want to win something called the Africa 29 prize, you have to shoot 29 different African species from a menu. There's a list that they give you. If you want to win the Cats of the World award, you have to fly around the world to all the different continents, shooting all sorts of different big cats, medium-sized cats, etc. And one of the most popular prizes that Safari Club offers is called the African Big Five Grand Slam. Now, for this, you have to shoot at least one lion, at least one elephant, at least one rhino, at least one leopard, and also a Cape buffalo. And it's very popular. So over the last 20 years, over 500 hunters have been presented with the African Big Five award. And the roll call of winners includes some very powerful people, including Stephen Chancellor, who is one of Donald Trump's main donors and fundraisers. Chancellor actually broke the world record for the biggest lion ever shot by a trophy hunter. And other people who are on this list include the former right-hand man to Russian President Vladimir Putin. I'm just going to talk a little bit about rhinos. A lot of attention has been paid in the media and elsewhere to rhino poaching in recent years, but not very much to rhino trophy hunting. However, trophy hunters are killing very, very large numbers of rhinos, and they're being allowed to do so. And some years, more rhinos have been killed in parts of South Africa by trophy hunters than by poachers. And if you look over the last decade, around 4,000 white rhinos were legally shot by trophy hunters, which is about a fifth to a sixth of the total remaining population of white rhinos in the wild. So when we talk about white rhinos, we have to take the impact of trophy hunting just as seriously as we do poaching. And there's also a loophole in international law which is being exploited by wildlife traffickers wanting to acquire large numbers of body parts, including of rhinos. So the law, the CITES law as it currently stands, it allows trophy hunters to shoot some of the world's most endangered species just for fun. And I've mentioned something called CITES a couple of times. So since the 1970s, there's been this international wildlife trade agreement called CITES, which stands for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species in Fauna and Flora. It carries on. Anyway, it supposedly prevents or restricts endangered animals from being killed. And in the annex to the treaty, there's 3 appendices. And these list the world's most endangered species by order of threat. So animals listed are in Appendix 1, for example. They're the ones who are most at risk of becoming extinct. And you've got leopards, cheetahs, black rhinos there. Appendix 2 are the next most threatened. And here you've got lions, elephants, polar bears, and so on, and white rhinos as well. And what the CITES Treaty says is that animals in Appendix 1, the most endangered, they cannot be traded. Therefore, they can't be killed unless there are what it calls exceptional circumstances. And the treaty also says that any trade in animals listed in Appendix 2, it also has to be strictly regulated to make sure that animals there don't eventually become extinct. So far, so good. Except there's a small problem. The treaty exempts trophy hunters, or perhaps more accurately, the law is applied differently when it comes to trophy hunters. And the reason for this is that trophy hunting isn't considered to be commercial trade as far as CITES is concerned. So when a trophy hunter, for example, shoots an elephant for its tusks or a rhino for its horns, those tusks and horns are considered to be personal and household effects. So in other words, the dead animal's head, trunk, tusks, horns, its whole body, whatever, is a souvenir, or it's an item of furnishing if you're going to hang the lion's head above the fireplace, or it's a fashion accessory if you're going to turn the giraffe or leopard skin to make a handbag or cover your sofa with. It's just, you need to fill out a form. And CITES records show, for example, that in recent years, the gallbladders of almost 5,000 bears have been traded under the guise of hunting trophies. Now, there's no way a gallbladder is going to be put up on, above the fireplace as a trophy from a hunt. The gallbladders are being acquired because of the bile within them, which is a vital ingredient in traditional Chinese medicines. So by claiming that they're hunting trophies, the traffickers are able to avoid bans or restrictions on the trade. And they even include gallbladders from polar bears. And it also appears that the Russian mafia may be involved in this trade. And we go back to rhinos. So just to give you an idea of the scale of the abuse in relation to rhinos, there's one of the trafficking criminals. He signed an agreement with the owner of a South African hunting reserve for horns with a street value estimated to be in the region of $20 million. And over a 7-year period, rhino horns worth up to $300 million found their way onto the black market, courtesy of the CITES trophy hunting loophole. And there was actually a big trial a few years ago of a leading Thai gangster. And he was using Vietnamese prostitutes and peasants and getting them to pretend to be trophy hunters. Now, in the last few years, Chinese hunters have suddenly appeared from nowhere. And they're now flocking to Africa in large numbers to acquire rhino so-called trophies for themselves. They're cutting out the middleman. And Chinese hunters, so-called hunters, they now make up the largest single nationality of rhino hunters in the world. And they take home about 1/3 of all the white rhino trophies, hunting trophies, leaving Africa every year. In 2013, at the International CITES Conference, the government of Kenya called for the world to stop all white rhino trophy hunting, at least until 2019, because of the clear evidence that there was that wildlife traffickers were running a coach and horses through the law, as the English say. So it was they're posing as trophy hunters and abusing it just to acquire it for the black market. But unfortunately, the law failed. And another pretty shocking thing, at last year's CITES conference, so this was 2019 in Geneva, despite the fact that there's now fewer than 5,000 black rhinos left in existence, trophy hunters were given permission at the conference to shoot twice as many black rhinos every year than they've been previously permitted to do. And the law also allows people to breed non-native animals for hunters to come and shoot in a lot of places. So in my book, Killing Game, The Extinction Industry, I name 2 companies in South Africa that right now are involved in canned tiger hunting. This is where you breed the tiger in captivity and shoot it in an enclosure. One of them, that's called Gotsoma Safaris, they also do canned jaguar hunting. So like the tiger, jaguars don't come from Africa. Jaguars come from South America. Tigers obviously come from Asia, but they breed them in captivity so that trophy hunters can shoot them in an enclosure. And quite a few of these exotic hunting theme parks, if you want to call it that, are in the US state of Texas. So there's one, for example, that's called Ox Ranch, and it's got giraffes, it's got zebras and lots of other African elephants. And you can actually use machine guns and drive around in World War II tanks and take your children, make a holiday for the whole family. It's also one of the very few places in the world where trophy hunters couldn't legally shoot kangaroos. So you've got Australian hunters, trophy hunters, who come from Australia to Texas to be able to shoot kangaroos because they can't do it in Australia. And there's another company called Texas Hunt Lodge, and it's got an extensive collection of animals that are either critically endangered or even extinct in the wild, which hunters can come and shoot. So the Scimitar horned oryx, that's a case in point. The 1997 printed edition of Safari Club International's record books lists the world's top trophy hunters who've been shooting the biggest scimitar horned oryxes. And the most recent was shot, I think, in the mid-1970s in Chad. And after that, there's no more entries in the book. And the reason was that scimitar horned oryxes had become extinct. They had literally hunted the scimitar horned oryxes to extinction. There used to be 1 million of these animals in Africa. And as a recent study put it, quite bluntly said, scimitar horned oryxes were targeted by trophy hunters for their horns. Anyway, the growing trend in breeding exotic species on private ranches in part reflects the fact that many of the animals that are popular with trophy hunters are dying out, or they've already disappeared from the wild. So there's an American businessman called Aaron Bunkley, and he runs one of these operations. It's called Texas Hunt Lodge. And he also owns a company called Africa Hunt Lodge. Anyway, it's known for breeding hybrid animals or animals with special characteristics for hunters who want something special, something different. For example, a black impala or a lion with a blonde or a black mane. Now, this, frankly, is just an example of the industry's sheer callousness when it comes to the welfare of animals. Because white lions, for example, they're much more prone to develop diseases and cancer. White springboks, they're very prone to skin cancer. Black impalas, much more susceptible to heat stroke, and so on and so forth. And in fact, as far as I'm concerned, one of the things that people aren't generally aware of when it comes to trophy hunting is the absolutely appalling suffering and cruelty which is usually inflicted on animals during the hunt. You know, this idea that the target animal, the lion, the elephant, the bear, whatever, is killed instantly with a single shot, it couldn't be further from the truth. There was a story which I worked on a few weeks ago, which was published in the British paper, The Mail, on Sunday. It was about a video which shows a professional hunting guide, and he shoots a lion and an elephant. He wounds them, then he goes off, and then he comes back a while later, and he finally kills them. But in between, they're just left there on the ground in agony. And there was a report in the German media earlier this year, I don't know if you saw it, was about an African hunting company that was taking part in the annual German hunting fair. And a representative from a hunting company tells undercover journalists that what they do is that they cripple leopards first by shooting them in the knees. And then it's easier for the paying customer to shoot the leopard close up. And what I found when I've been looking at official records, actually, is that cruelty, pain, suffering, that's the norm. It's not the exception. So a number of US states have published reports showing that more than half of all the animals that are shot by hunters in the states aren't killed quickly. Many of them somehow manage to crawl away. The hunter then can't find them because they've crawled into the bush or whatever. And in many cases, the animal just simply dies a long, slow, very painful death from blood loss, infection, sepsis, shock, etc., etc. And trophy hunters deliberately don't go, usually, for the brain shot, which is, you know, the method most likely to lead to an instantaneous kill, because that would spoil the look of the trophy when you take it home and put it above the fireplace. So what they tend to do is something called the heart-lung shot through the shoulder. This is a really difficult shot to take, even in optimal conditions, because you're likely to be 200 meters away. You have to rely on there being no wind, and of course the animal standing absolutely still for long enough for you to take the shot. Anyway, I'll start wrapping out now. So you will hear, and you'll see it on social media a lot, trophy hunters and their supporters. They say, look, trophy hunting is necessary for conservation. And frankly, look, I'll say to you this, if trophy hunting was so good for elephants, why have elephant populations crashed from 20 million to less than 500,000? If trophy hunting was so good for lions, why have lion numbers plummeted from over 1 million to 20,000 and perhaps even less? Why have rhinos collapsed from 1 million to 30,000? Why don't we go and introduce trophy hunting for tigers and orangutans? Why aren't conservationists and scientists saying this is what we should do to be protecting and bringing back these species? And the fact of the matter, of course, it's just utter nonsense. But the impacts of trophy hunting, the conservation impacts, they've been known for a very long time. This isn't news. They've been known for over a century. So in 1908, for example, one of the leading English trophy hunters of his time, Frederick Selous, after whom the game reserve is named after, and he said the following. I'm just going to read it to you. He says, "Since my first arrival in 1871, I have seen game of all kinds gradually decrease and dwindle in numbers to such an extent that I thought that nowhere south of the Great Lakes could there be a corner of Africa left where the wild animals had not been very much thinned out." And artificial selection, which I was talking about in relation to lions and elephants, that's been known about for a very long time as well. Charles Darwin wrote about it in 1896, that's 124 years ago. So anyway, look, we've got to put a stop to this. We have to act quickly as well, because things are already really bad and they're headed in the wrong direction. So South Africa, which is the center of the African hunting industry, it's seen a 50% rise in hunting trophies leaving the country over the past decade. And its canned hunting industry, which Chris is going to talk about, it's expanding into new and other animals like zebras. But even traditional European markets, such as Germany, for example, it's still growing 20% over the past decade. And we're seeing new Eastern European markets emerging as well. So 40% growth amongst Russian clients. And countries such as Canada, 200% increase. And of course, China, huge increase. It's over 1,000%. But, so I've been telling you all the bad news. It's not all doom and gloom. There is some good news. So The first is that the general public is very, very, very much on our side. If you go to the UK, you go to Europe, Germany, the US, the figures are pretty much the same. 80%, 85% or more of people, they loathe trophy hunting. They want it ended. They want it stopped. They want it banned. They'll support a trophy import ban. Also, the media is very interested in this issue. It's a very media-friendly story, and they want to hear what we have to say. And there are many policymakers and government ministers, they're on our side as well. They don't understand why would somebody go and shoot an animal, let alone an endangered animal, just for the sheer hell of it, for the sport of it. And there are many key influences, people in positions of influence who are on our side as well. Church leaders, TV figures, sports personalities, musicians, as well as, of course, leading conservationists and scientists. Anyway, a lot of the information about trophy imports and the trophy trade, which you're going to need for your campaigns in Belgium and elsewhere to inform the public and the media and the policymakers, it actually exists in the public domain. And in my books, Killing Game and Trophy Hunters Exposed, I point to the sources. I also point to the scientific studies. So the information is there. It's there for you to use. And there's a ready and willing audience for it. And of course, we at the Campaign to Ban Trophy Hunting are always there to help you. So look, I hope that's given you some of the key information, hopefully some inspiration as well for you to go out there and help put an end to this barbaric industry.
What have you been working on in the UK and how far have you come?
Yeah, sure. Let me tell you about that. So I guess, well, the campaign to ban trophy hunting hasn't actually been going that long at all. It's only about 18 months. And it actually started because we'd heard that the government of Botswana was going to be bringing back elephant trophy hunting. And it was at that moment that, a penny dropped, that there wasn't, there's many organizations, that are already in existence that are against trophy hunting, think that it's wrong, think that it should end. There wasn't really a dedicated organization working on just that issue. And there wasn't, if you like, a strategy. So if we say, well, trophy hunting has got to end, well, what does that look like? And how do you get there? And so that was essentially what we set up, was an organization dedicated to the issue, but also which had a plan, a strategic plan. And because we're based in the UK, it seemed obvious that the first place to start would be with the UK. And actually, there's a powerful symbolism in that Britain was very much the country which invented modern day trophy hunting and exported it to the colonies in Africa and India and so on. And of course, still retains very strong links with South Africa, which is a very important country, with some of the other southern African nations, and indeed some of the other, Commonwealth countries like Canada and so on, where trophy hunting is still going on. So it seemed a very logical place to start, was to build a campaign within the UK to stop the import of hunting trophies. And so we built up a coalition of NGOs, of partners in the press, for example, so people in different media organizations, different public figures, so representing different sectors of society, and started doing our research and looking at what was actually going on in terms of imports of hunting trophies into Britain, what animals, what kind of trophies, so what kind of body parts, and really giving that information to the press. And then we started polling, opinion polls, so finding out what the general public actually thought about that, and then sharing that information both with the press but also with politicians. And we built a cross-party coalition. Now, British politics, as many will know, at the moment particularly, is very polarized. And the Brexit process has created this kind of extremes of big divisions of opinion. But what we wanted to do was to try to present this as an issue that actually everyone could get on board with. And so, we reached out to everyone in the political spectrum. In fact, we had a letter published earlier this year in the Times by some of our supporters, and it had signatures of members of Parliament from all 9 political parties that take their seat in Parliament. Now, that has never happened before. on any issue. And we've had a number of debates, motions that have been tabled, and again, they've all been of a cross-party nature. And many members of Parliament have filmed interviews talking about why they wanted it banned, and done photo ops and so on. So we've managed to really put the issue on the front page, literally, if you like. So a number of newspapers have covered the issue of trophy hunting as a front page story because of our investigation. So it's pushed it up, the political ladder of priorities, if you like. There's always this sort of big pool of issues that politicians are having to deal with, and the art is really trying to sort of bring something to the surface. So that was something that we did, working with others in the media, getting that issue really known about and discussed and debated, and getting very high profile figures really to be speaking out, because although they're not driving public opinion, they're representing it. So if you've got actors or musicians like Ed Sheeran or Liam Gallagher and so on, and indeed the Catholic Church of England and Wales as well, these are people who actually are speaking on behalf of their constituents, of their supporters, their followers, their fans, and so on. So it really brings it to the surface and makes people aware of it. So where we are now is, well, we had a general election at the end of last year, you might recall, and it was the promise to ban hunting trophies was included in the election manifesto of all the major parties. So it was the first time it had been included in any election manifesto, and everyone did it this time. And we have something in Britain called the Queen's Speech. The closest equivalent I can think of is in America, they had the State of the Union address by the president. Basically what it is, it's the government setting out its legislative program for the forthcoming year, or the forthcoming parliamentary session. And so the pledge to ban hunting trophy imports was included there. And the Prime Minister has gone on social media. That's obviously what a lot of politicians do nowadays. Donald Trump does it all the time. Gone on Twitter saying, this is what I believe, this is what we have to do. And Boris Johnson, as Prime Minister, has also said in the House of Commons, yep, the government is going to do this. Now, of course, this little matter of coronavirus has come along. And it's created this, almost state of paralysis across the political spectrum. Government departments, they're all very much focusing on how to deal with the coronavirus crisis. So things have come to a halt. However, we did have earlier this year a public consultation. So the government launched a public consultation inviting individuals, organizations, scientists, etc., to submit evidence as well as just give their opinion on the issue. The government put forward 4 possible options for people to input around or to discuss and to say what they thought about. So one was just a ban on endangered species. Another was kind of more scrutiny on a case-by-case basis. And then option 3, which was the one obviously that we were supporting, was a total ban on all hunting trophies. And then option 4 was no change. So keeping the status quo, no ban at all. So the consultation finished in February, and the government was due to give a summary of what the consultation's inputs and the evidence provided had said, I think about within 3 months. But of course, it's missed that deadline because of the virus. So, and now we're kind of getting into that period, but just like in Belgium, politicians are on holiday. We're in the middle of start of the summer holidays, middle of the summer holidays. And so a lot of things have ground to a halt. But we're hopeful that when Parliament returns, the momentum will pick up again. And actually, it's interesting that, since the launch of my 2 books, so I had 2 books, one in May and then one in July, which coincided actually with the 5th anniversary of the shooting of Cecil. And there was a lot of media coverage that came out. So it kind of put the issue back on, if you like, the front pages. And in fact, we had a response from the Prime Minister, saying, look, yes, I'm going to do this. I promise I'm going to do this. So, look, we're hoping that still this year we're going to see a positive outcome. We're going to see a concrete announcement. We've been asking for the government, to set out its timeline and to say exactly what scope of the ban, what it will cover. We don't have those answers yet. But, in all of these things, you have to keep pushing. You can't just sort of, push once and then back away and hopefully the door will open. No, this is the system of government often doesn't want to change by its own volition. And you have to push very, very, very hard to open that door gradually. And as the door starts opening, you have to keep pushing until it opens all the way. So I guess where we are at the moment is we've managed to open the door a little bit, but now we have to continue to push. We have to hold the politicians to account. We have to keep pressing them to deliver on their commitment, because they've made a commitment. It was in the election manifesto. It was in the Queen's speech. The Prime Minister said he's going to do it. So they promised to do it. So now we have to make sure that they fulfill their promise. And as I say, it's the one rule in politics, in campaigning: you have to keep going. You never stop, never give up until you finally win. So that's where we are at the moment.
Okay, that's great. I wanted to suggest that we answer one question that Christina asked, but I feel like you almost answered it. She said she has been advocating against trophy hunting for some time, and even some fellow activists have started to support trophy hunting because some scientists are so good at selling the idea that huge tracts of land can be safe without trophy hunting. How can we convince governments or the mainstream public that there are better alternatives than trophy hunting to protect wildlife and empower communities? But like you said, maybe it's a question of keep pushing.
You do have to keep pushing, but there's a lot of nonsense put out by the trophy hunting industry that simply doesn't stack up. And it's not surprising, because obviously these people have got a vested interest. They do not want the industry to end. They benefit from it. It's their bread and butter, as the English say. So it's a source of income, source of status, and nobody likes to lose something. So they will fight. Of course, they will fight. But the evidence is very clear on this. And without seeming to sort of just be promoting my book, I would encourage people to read Killing Game. Whatever the name of my second book is, I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, Killing Game, The Extinction Industry, because there I actually talk about the evidence, the science around trophy hunting and conservation, and the claims that are made by people who support trophy hunting. And it's very, very clear that trophy hunting has had only a negative impact on wildlife. And a lot of these arguments that they come up with are entirely spurious. They don't add up. And at the end of the day, there are far more beneficial alternatives out there which are already working. You look, for example, there was a report published earlier this year, actually, that calculated that if, for example, South Africa, which is such an important part of the industry, were to make a wholesale switch from trophy hunting to nature tourism, so photographic safaris and so on, that would create 11 times as many jobs for poor people in local rural communities, and also generate far more money for conservation, for anti-poaching measures and so on. So, this argument that suddenly, if we stop trophy hunting, then everything will go to seed and, it'll be terrible. Well, look at what's happened in Tanzania. So over a quarter of Tanzania's land surface is covered by hunting estates, but it generates nothing. I mean, it contributes something like 0.22% to the country's GDP. And because they've hunted all the animals, so they've gone, a lot of these hunting estates are now abandoned. They're empty. But what hasn't happened is what, the other side claim will happen is if you stop trophy hunting. It hasn't suddenly been invaded by people taking it over. And you know what? Frankly, there's a really racist undertone to this argument, because it's basically saying, look, we've got to leave it to the rich white men, and they are mainly white men, who come in and hunt the animals for fun, and that will protect the environment and protect wildlife, because otherwise then these poor black people will come over and turn the land over to or they'll hunt the animals for bushmeat. It's saying, look, leave it to the rich white hunter, he knows best, as opposed to local people. And look, the argument just doesn't add up. Even I'll give you one example. So let's look at African elephants. If you look at the money, the so-called trophy fees that are payable to the governments that have been generated from elephant trophy hunting in the last few years, the total amount comes to something like $2 billion. Now, there is no way on earth that $2 billion has been invested in elephant conservation thanks to trophy hunting. It's rubbish. It's nonsense. Let's take the example of, it's World Lion Day. We'd be talking about Cecil. When Cecil was shot, and that horrible man, Walter Palmer, paid $50,000 for the privilege, about, I don't know, 30,000 of which went to the government as the trophy fee. And that supposedly goes into, conservation funding and so on. There's no way that $30,000 went back into the area for conservation. But even if it had, let's say for the sake of argument that it had, well, Andrew Loveridge, who was the scientist who actually radio collared Cecil, and he monitored him right up until the day he was shot, or a few days before. Now, he's actually calculated the cost of trying to conserve an animal like Cecil and his habitat and so on. And he worked out that over his lifetime, the cost is something like $1 million. So $30,000 doesn't come anywhere close to it. What he did say, he said two things. Firstly, if you have nature tourism, an animal like Cecil will generate an income of about $100,000 a year. So over the course of a lifetime, which, for the average line is about 15 years, you can see that the money, the sums really do add up. But he also did a survey of local people in that area, and he found that, look, the money wasn't going to local communities. It wasn't providing them with an incentive to protect areas for wildlife. They weren't benefiting in any way. And he basically called this whole racket, he called it literally that, he called it like a blackmail racket. This argument that, look, if you take away trophy hunting from us, every animal will die. And it's nonsense. There's a big US congressional report that was published a few years ago that looked at all of the science and said very clearly, look, this claim that trophy hunting saves wildlife, protects the environment is just that, because the evidence is not there. Anyway, as I say, I go into this in some depth, so it's got all the arguments, all the evidence in my book, Killing Game, the Extinction Industry, and I recommend people have a look at that, because there you've got it all there.